How y'all doing tonight? I am going to wear you out with slides. There's a zillion slides in this thing. That being said, if you go to bkcorner.org, the slides are already posted there on my website, so you can have them. You don't have to take notes. They're all there for you in a PDF, okay? I am going to run through this. I'm not going to read the slides. You'll absorb them as I'm going, but I'm just going to talk to the key points to them. Bob and I are going to tag team this. I'm going to go through the first half, maybe a smidge more, and then Bob's going to pick it up. The first part is to explain the process of making mead and recommending a process that you follow. And then the second part, we're actually going to talk about assembly, and we brought show and tell. With no further ado, you know who I am. I'm not going to go through any further introduction. Let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to discuss unlocking a successful process. I'm going to talk about ingredients. I'm going to talk about nutrition and nutrient add-ins. I'm going to discuss a traditional way versus what I'll call a more modern way. And as we get through, again, we'll talk about the yeasts that you could buy. This took months, if not years, to figure out. It is not going to do it justice in a single presentation, but it's going to give you the majority of the blueprint you need in order to make mead and make a good, solid mead. If I think about the way that it works, if you can make a base mead of just honey and water and it tastes good, then whatever you go on from there, you're going to do fine. So let's say you want to make a cherry mead. If you can make a good mead and add cherries to it, you're going to have a good mead with a cherry flavor, so you'll be fine. There are two paths, right? We know that the Vikings, and they put honey and water together. By serendipity, they made mead. You could also do what we did, which is labor over the process and figure out, because how many of you know who Sergio Mutella is? Sergio has Melavino, which is a commercial meadery here in New Jersey, and his stuff is spectacular. He goes to Colorado to the World Championships, and he just kills because his mead is so good. He learned a process. He's not trusting it to just honey and water. And a lot of what I'm going to tell you about was me researching what Sergio told us at a state meeting, and then I finally dug in and went all the way to the bottom to try and figure out how to do it. So which are you? Are you that person who's just going to take honey and water in and go serendipity, or are you somebody that's going to follow a process? If you're not somebody that bakes a cake by trying to make sure that the eggs are room temperature and whatever, then you could follow along tonight, okay? But this is, I hate to say, a process. I want to mitigate a poor mead. I don't want a bad mead. No jet fuel. If you've ever drunk a mead that's not good, and they're kind enough to give you some and you drink it and you go, I don't need to do this again. That's not what we're after. And we all know as beekeepers what the value of the honey is that we put in. And I took so long to learn how to make mead, because I'll be damned if I was going to make jet fuel out of what I worked so hard to do. So you want to get a better than average mead, of course. And this is how you do it. No jet fuel. Fermented honey and water is mead. You mix honey, water together, you're going to form a simple syrup. That simple syrup is going to have different yeasts from nature in there, and eventually they will consume the sugars and turn alcoholic if you leave it for a period of time. The byproduct of the yeast consumption results in flavor, which hopefully makes a good mead for you. But it also, when it goes wrong, results in jet fuel. It's when the yeast eats the sugar, its byproduct is the alcohol that you drink that becomes a beverage. The byproduct of yeast consumption gone wrong is jet fuel. To avoid jet fuel, what do we need to do? If you've learned nothing out of this presentation, keep your yeast happy. And that's the key that unlocks for the Tasna method, which I'll explain to you in a moment. In order to understand how to make mead, you're going to read instructions, and mead makers use terminology, and you just can't avoid it. You have to be able to weigh and measure, so to speak. So we're going to go through some of that and just tell you what it means, okay? When I start out with a mead recipe, like anybody else, I want to know how sweet it's going to be in the end. I don't want it to be cloyingly sweet, but I don't want it to be dry. I want it to have sweet flavor. I want it to have a bouquet. I want it to be decent. I don't want it to be moonshine, but I also don't want it to be so weak that I don't get a proper little buzz off of it, if you want to say it that way, right? And when you make mead, beyond the taste of just sweet honey wine made from honey, you're going to get mouthfeel and other characteristics of it. You can control all that if you understand how to do the recipe. So you choose a recipe that suits your outcome, and then you put together the components that make your mead for you. There are terms that say, I want to make a mead and describe it as a specific type of sweetness in the industry. There's other aspects of whether something tastes sweet to you, how much acidity it has, and so on. But for the most part, you understand that if you drink wine, there's dry wines, there's regular wines, and there's dessert wines like a port that are super, super sweet. Similar. When honey provides the sweetness, some of it's consumed by the yeast, but what's left over is the sweet that you taste when you drink the beverage. You measure at the beginning and you measure at the end the sugar concentration. Whatever got consumed turned to alcohol, whatever's left is what you taste. Now, you could do mead in a couple different ways. One thing that they say is you could let the yeast consume all the sugars, and then afterwards, if your alcohol is not sweet, you can back sweeten it by adding honey solution after. There's a lot of ways to skin a cat. There's a thing called gravity. Gravity is not what holds us to the earth in this case. Gravity is the amount of concentration of sugar or food for the yeast inside the liquid that you mix. Water as a base is a 1.0 reading, and everything above 1.0 when we're talking about mead is the sweetness of the concentration of sugars. And you use a tool called a hydrometer, which we have. When you float it in the water, based on the amount of concentration of sugars, it floats and it gives you a graph on the side and it tells you how much is in there. When you're making mead, you're going to take a beginning gravity, you're going to take a readings throughout, middle gravities, and you're going to take a final gravity, and you're going to kind of see how things are going as you progress. The first one that you take is called original gravity. Now, mead makers, for whatever reason, they're very sloppy about their lingo. And a lot of times they'll tell you the starting gravity or the specific gravity is, they really mean the original gravity, okay? When you mix your honey and your water to make something called the must, you take a reading, and the first reading you get once you finish your concentration is called original gravity. Hang on to that because we're going to give you a formula later. Went too far. Final gravity is at the end. You're trying to achieve a specific final gravity. Yes?
Kevin, is this same concept as relative density or specific gravity in physics?
It's
the ratio of
yes, the ratio of sweetness in the liquid, yes, in the concentration.
In something to water.
Yes, yes.
It's a measure of the density compared to water.
Correct.
So
yes,
specific gravity, it's the same thing.
Same concept.
Okay, thank you. Now I know what it is.
Yeah. Okay, so when you finish your mead and you're done, you want to measure it and you want to determine how sweet it is and how much alcohol you've made, you get your final gravity. Now the other term that's up here is specific gravity. At any given point, from the time that I start to the time that I put it in the bottle, I take measurements. Those things are called specific gravity. Now again, some mead makers use that specific gravity for all their readings. This is what a hydrometer looks like. We have one here with us today. You put it in that container filled with liquid and it floats, and wherever the water meets the gauge is what your reading is. If I were to say to you, here's a bottle of mead, tell me how sweet it is, you're going to measure it with a hydrometer and you're going to get a reading that's above 1, because 1 is water, and it has some sort of concentration. Now, 1.01 to 1.015 is what we would, most of us, say, that's a nice sweetness. General rule of thumb from Mead world, okay? And you could see that you have dry and you have semi-sweet or medium, all the way to something like a dessert mead. If you're achieving a dessert mead, then obviously you would start with more sugar and you would use a yeast that would leave more sugar in the final solution. So you need one of those devices. Specific gravity, again, is any particular measurement that you're taking. They are beneficial because there are times when you measure how much yeast has been consumed over a period of time, and then that decides when you add the next yeast. I'll talk about that in a moment. On the second side of how sweet it is, how much alcohol there is. If you've drunk a beer or wine, whatever, looked at any of the labels, the good news is they use ABV, alcohol by volume. Same thing. I don't expect you to remember that formula on the bottom, but the cool thing is there's calculators out in the world. And if you enter your starting gravity and your finishing gravity, it'll tell you what your ABV is. Think about yeast as a living organism as it's consuming the sugars. Forgive me, but what it's giving off in your liquid is alcohol, and the more it eats, the more alcohol it creates. So you could say that they can calculate how much sugar has been eaten by the yeast and figure out what the alcohol output would be. If you compare original gravity, final gravity, that's how you determine your ABV. There's 3 common terms in the world. Hydromel, which is also called a session. Pretty common when you go out to a meadery to buy that's the type you get. It's usually a session or a standard mead. And the other one is a sack mead. Sack mead, I don't know, there is a reason for the term, I'm not going to go into it, but it's really, yeah, you're going to get your money's worth if you're going to go for it there. Doesn't mean it tastes bad, but it'll give you a shot.
You'll wind up in the sack.
You'll wind up in the sack. So you could see the comparisons there. Light beer to a conventional beer to a table wine, and so on. Okay, and if you want to make a sack mead, you could do that. While you're making mead, you're putting yeast, which is floating in suspension in the water, eating all the sugars. And as the yeasts do their thing, they end up eventually dying. They're perishable. They'll die in your liquid. And most of them will typically, depending on the type of yeast, just float down and gather at the bottom as dead soldiers. The terms to describe what happens as that process is taking place are these. Lees, what ends up on the bottom. Flocculation is where it clumps together, and as it gathers together, it tends to sink and become lees. And the last one is say it, Bob? Autolysis, I could never do that. Which is, as it breaks down, this is what is giving the flavors. Now, note what it says there. Generally, you have 3 weeks before the decomposition of the lees will eventually turn to sulfur-like and ruin your mead. Okay, so you're going to pay attention to your mead as it settles out, and once it settles out and it stops bubbling and so on, you're going to take the liquid off of the lees, transfer it into a clean container, and let it finish there. So you do need to understand this concept.
What's rack?
I'm going to tell you that. Rack is to take it out of the lees.
Do you just dispose of the leaves?
You just dispose of the lees. Okay?
In important thing there is that water lysis. If you leave it too long on the leaves, it rots, basically. Think about it that way, and it gives off sulfurous flavor.
It gets really funky. You taste yeast, not in a good way, right? You've had really yeasty breads. That's what your drink tastes like. And you don't want to be drinking a beverage, getting yeast every single time to your nose and taste. I want to run a path for ingredients. So bear with me. I'm going to take you on a journey here and I'm going to build. That's the whole point of this. Okay, so meh, okay, awful. That's not what we're after. So what we need to understand is how do we do the building blocks to get ourselves to a mead that's drinkable and actually pleasant, right? And again, I'll remind you, we're using one of the most expensive ingredients you could possibly buy, as you guys all know, right? There's two paths. You can go the way the Vikings did it, mix honey, water, and you can make mead because there's natural yeasts, and actually I brought you one of those tonight to look at, and sometimes it turns out the best mead you've ever made. But the fact of the matter is there's people who know how to do this and repeat this process. They're craftspeople, and generally, if you just left honey and water in a container and tried to drink it later, how many of you have ever left honey out, it got water in it from the rain, and then you found it like 4 days later and you opened the thing up and the container has exploded? It's nasty. The modern way is to control the process and technique, adding the ingredients as you go, and you control and keep the yeast happy. Remember we said yeast is the way to go, but when I start telling you Go Firm and Fermate O and Fermate K and DAP, what is all that stuff? Why do we use it? What's the point of it? Honey and water, natural yeasts. Sometimes it works, other times it doesn't, but when it's a poor outcome, jet fuel. We don't want that. If I take honey and water, I can mask bad outcomes by adding in add-ins. So a lot of times you see people take stuff like raisins and put it in there. They used raisins quite a bit. It was actually a very recommended thing from early times. You'll see a lot of old-time recipes tell you to put raisins in. It was good and bad, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But ideally, that raisin gave a kind of date, kind of plum flavor, and that's usually very pleasant in a mead. But even with flavorings over jet fuel tastes like jet fuel, okay? So they decided they needed to steer the outcome. They learned this from the wine people. If I put specific yeasts in, my yeasts that I add outcompete the natural yeast, or at least work in harmony with them, and I get a better product. And if you look at the yeast industry for wine, they have every yeast catalog, its attributes, how long it takes to eat the sugar, what kind of volatiles it gives off, sweet flavors, more body and all that. We'll tell you where their charts are to get them. But specific strains of yeast behave differently, so you have to kind of do your research and say, I'm making this type of mead, a sack mead or a melomel or other things, and I have to choose the right yeast to get the job done. No different than when I'm making a cake, I'm going to choose the right ingredients, okay? But even when you put honey and water and the right yeast together, what do you get? Jet fuel. Something's still wrong. Something's still missing. So they decided, scientifically, what was missing is nutrients. Honey, water, yeast, and adding nutrients. When the yeast doesn't get what it needs, the byproduct of it being stressed and not having the right foods, just like us, is undesirable compounds given off. If you take honey, water, yeast, and nutrients, that's a new way of thinking, but I need to control the nutrients that are going in. And ideally, what they figured out is the missing thing is what? Nitrogen. It's nitrogen. So the mystery to Go Firm, Fermate O, Fermate K, and DAP and such is nitrogen, okay? So they said take honey, water, yeast, and nutrients. I'm sorry, I skipped one point there. Ideally, a level of 150 to 220 ppm of nitrogen should be present throughout the process of making the mead until the leaves fall, so that the yeast have nitrogen and minerals to eat along with the sugars. What do you get? Honey falls short with only 30 parts per million, sorry. So you can understand that honey is good food, but it's missing the nutrients. So if I take assimilable, which is a fancy word for it'll take it in, right? I look at these products down here and I see if I give a dose, that's how much nitrogen I can insert into the process. So they said, okay, now we got it unlocked. We're going to take honey and water and yeast and these nutrients, which are rich in nitrogen, and we're going to add it to our mead, and our yeast is going to be happy. Yeah, a lot of times it works. It works really good, but it doesn't work every time. That's a bit of a problem. So honey, the challenge is yeast is going to become stressed if it doesn't get the nutrients the way that it wants them. And there's something missing with just throwing nutrients in and being done with it. If the yeast goes along and it runs out of the specific nutrient at a specific time, it gives off flavors. It could taste like burnt rubber. That doesn't sound good in a mead. You have to treat your yeast well, and the unlock to that is staggered nutrition. So I'm going to just blow through these real quick. This is Go Firm and DAP. These are natural yeast products or other derivatives. Most people use Go Firm. They've gotten away from DAP. I'll tell you why in a second. And they use Fermate O and or Fermate K. Both of those two are, somewhat interchangeable, although a lot of people I know go with Fermate O. It's the newer formulation of Fermate, and it's supposed to be superior to the other. Again, I can't go down to detail, but if you want to learn about this, you can go read about it. DAP has gotten a black eye lately, and you can see here that part of it is that creates carcinogens. It's banned for winemaking, but for the home brewer, you could still use it.
It's okay if you get cancer.
Yeah, okay, moving on, right? So you choose your nutrients, personal preference, what you do. Fermate O, okay? But the nutrients over time is the final piece of the puzzle, over time. Honey, water, yeast, nutrients over time. So what was missing? They throw the nutrients in, the yeast would be happy for a small period of time, but then they'd run out of gas at the finish line and they'd start injecting terrible flavors in your mead. So they figured out you have to feed them over a period of time. And different yeasts have different, they're like relatives at a wedding. Some of them pig out and some of them graze. They all characteristically go through the sugars in different ways. If you go to Lavlin, I think is the name of the way you say it, they show you all the yeasts and they tell you how fast and how much a yeast will consume. You can then, based on the yeast you choose, most of them are from wine, put the right amount of nutrients over a specific time for that exact yeast. Isn't that cool? No jet fuel. So there's a nutrition addition schedule. And almost universally now they figured out that you're going to add a little bit at 24 hours. You're going to add a little bit at 48 hours. You're going to add a little bit at 72 hours after pitch, which is when you put the yeast in. That's the unlock. Instead of throwing it all in at once, you're going to give it to it over a time period.
What's the must, Kevin? Is that the honey in the water?
The must is the honey in the water. Yep. The fourth nutrition addition is made at the 1/3 sugar break on day 7, whichever comes first. I'm going to explain that. As you're taking specific gravities, you know the start, you know the end. When it gets to 1/3 sugar consumption, you'll pitch your yeast. If you get to day 7 and it hasn't got there, you'll pitch your, I'm sorry, not yeast, nutrition. You'll pitch your nutrition in, okay? 1/3 of the sugar is consumed, or day 7, whichever comes first. This is Mead website. If you want to get a really good primer, it's one of the main things I use to figure all this out, but there's tons of websites out there. You're going to calculate the gravities, original and final. You're going to get your ABV, and then you're going to figure out how to figure your formula based on the calculators that are available online. Then you determine from your, this is the way I did it, ABV that you want, how much honey to throw in. Hold on a second. It looks like this. I have numbers because I know the formula already of the recipe that we used, so that's where they came from. Final gravity, remember what we said, that's the key sweetness we want. And the 1.115, just give it to me, that's how much I want to start with, because I want 0.105. If I put these two numbers in this Mead website calculator and I click the button, it's going to tell me that 13.78 is my end alcohol by volume. 14% like beer, that's pretty good for me. So if I take that number, 13.78, and I put it in this other calculator on Mead, all the same page, by the way, and I have a link to it, and I tell it I want to make a 1 gallon batch, that's number 1, and I enter the ABV, 13.78, and I go down there and I click the calculate button on this calculator. At number 4, it's going to tell me I need 2.92 pounds of honey to a gallon of water, because it's a gallon batch. So the mystery about how much honey and water to mix in order to get your mead, to get the final gravity and that ABV is all solved in this calculator. There's tons of these online. It's kind of cool, right? Now, that thing says pounds, but you see there's a drop down there by that number 4? You can calculate by pounds, fluid ounces. I do grams for everything, yeah.
The moisture content of the honey and the type of honey, as far as medium, light, medium,
Yeah.
forest, whatever, you're going by flavor also to get to the end, you're going to go into that, like how you choose, or what you normally use as far as that goes. Do you use like a very, very light spring honey, or do you use something like mid-year, or what moisture content are you looking for?
Yeah, so the question lies with your starter honey. We're all beekeepers, we all have starter honey. Obviously you want to use a honey you want to eat, add a spoon, right? That tastes good.
Yeah.
Typically the lighter honey, more floral, makes a better mead.
Okay.
But if you wanted to make something out of buckwheat honey, a mead that has that flavor, that's okay. I would think that the typical reading 17% moisture-ish is fine. I wouldn't start with something really thick, but from what I've read, just pick a honey. Don't use store-bought. That's really the only rule that they tell you. And the other thing is, that says 9.921 or 2.921. You don't have to be that specific. When I listened to Sergio talk about this on his podcast, he's like, good enough is perfect, right? As to the type of honey you use, you don't really have to fuss, yeah.
You know what, if you crunch the numbers, the difference in moisture content between a honey that's like 15.5%
Yeah.
and 18.5% in terms of the actual water that's going into that gallon is insignificant.
Yeah, Landy will know because she adds water in order to make some of her concoctions when she puts dry ingredients in, right? So you're right, yeah. The short answer to your question is I don't believe it matters. Just use your honey, good quality stuff. Stuff that tastes good will make good mead.
But how do you get the original gravity? Is that just from when you're making from just historically what you know? Because otherwise, if I want to
So this is the other way you could do this. I didn't show you this because I wanted you to, for this presentation, wanted to carry the ABV number, right? But the other thing you could do with this calculator, ready, is you could put the final gravity in, and you could put 14 in for the percent and click the button and it'll tell you the starting gravity. Okay? So it works that way too, and that's how you do it. That's how I know the number is 1.15. I use the calculator. It works in a triangle, basically. That's a great question. Yeah, so here you see I use this number and that number. If I left that blank and I put 14 in here and I clicked on it, it would give me that number in this calculator. And there's formulas out there that do it, but I just use this calculator. Yeah, I'm glad you said that. Thank you. Okay. If I take this, now I know how much honey and water to make my must to start, and I have an idea maybe of the type of yeast that I want because I've researched it independently of this. I'm now going to go to Sergio's website and use the TOSNA calculator. I'll let you absorb what TOSNA stands for. Tailored Organic Staggered Nutrient Addition. This is the modern of modern. This tells you if I take, let's see how this, the gallons or liters, 1, and I indicate 2, I want to use ferment O, my preference. 3, I put in my starting gravity that I figured out from the other calculator. And 4, I picked the yeast. I went to the Lalvin website and I looked at the characteristics. It gets more body, it leaves a fruity flavor, it's nice and sweet, it makes a light, sparkly kind of mead. I use that yeast. I hit all those things and I go down to the bottom of the page and it tells me what I need. I want to add 2.5 of Go Firm grams to 50 milliliters of water. There's even a guide here that tells you how to mix those two things. And since I'm using ferment O, I need 6.8 grams to 2 grams of yeast of my Lalvin BA11. And I am going to take that 6.8 grams and I am going to give 4 24-hour, 48-hour, 72-hour, and 1/3 or 1 week, 1.7 doses. Now, one thing that tells you right away is you need a really good scale to get to 1.7. But again, Sergio says it's not that fussy. Sergio knows. There's your 1/3 sugar break calculation. You started at 1.115, remember 1.115. When it gets to your reading specific gravity of 1.075, you pitch your yeast for the final, or 7 days. Don't worry about bricks and sugar and so on. You could do this, right? Couldn't you do this? This is pretty easy. This is what we did. So honey plus water plus yeast plus nutrients gives you a good, clear, basic mead, honey and water mead. But what if you want add-ins? What if you want to add cherries? What if you wanted to do blueberry and so on? You could do that. But when you add things like raisins and cherries and whatever, don't they have sugars in them? Yes. They do. In that calculator, you can indicate that I'm using a pound of cherries and it will calculate the sugar out and adjust the ingredients. So that's where the add-ins are in that screenshot that was there that I skipped right past. But once you get to the point of making a basic mead, you can then specify your add-in ingredients and it'll tell you how to adjust your formula to account for it. I talked about raisins before. If you go to YouTube University and you listen to one of the most popular mead making guys, he'll tell you just pitch raisins in. He's emphatic. You're absurd. You're nuts if you follow all this. Just pitch raisins in. Raisins are not the answer because why? They don't have the nitrogen. They're not very good in nutrients. They give you good flavor and they give you sugar, but they're not much different than maybe you want to add more honey or something differently.
Didn't you say a while ago that grapes were high in nutrients, or did I misread that?
I didn't hear that, sorry.
Didn't you indicate a while ago that grapes were high in nutrients, or did I misread that?
It said you could add grapes for nutrients and so on. That's what people were doing. It was more for flavor, not so much. They didn't understand nutrients back then,
Okay.
right? They were adding grapes, they were adding raisins and other things to mask the flavor of the jet fuel and give flavor, not so much the nutrients. Unaware to them, they were adding nutrients because there are nutrients in those products, right? And grapes do have nutrients because that's what wine yeasts do better with them.
But ultimately, my question is, once grapes become raisins, that they lose the nutrient value? Is that?
Yeah, I don't know the science to it, sorry.
Okay, no.
Yeah, Bob, you want to?
So I was a winemaker well before I was a mead maker. And with wine, you still have to add nitrogen to it in order to make the yeast happy. Okay, so grapes are not the answer to the nutrient issue.
We have a winery near us, and I've done the tour, and they do add nutrients.
Yeah, I've got like a lot of great chicken manure that's very high in nitrogen.
That's what DAP is. No, I'm kidding. Okay, so what we're saying here is whatever the add-ins are, they add nutrient load, right? And the formulas, calculators know that. Somebody's done the science and they tell you what the difference is. Coming back to yeast, because what's the key thing? The honey, the water, and really the yeast are super important. There are different forms of yeast that you can buy. You can buy it in wet form, you could buy it in dry form. And as I've said, there's tons of vendors. Now, most people in the mead industry are very familiar with wine yeasts, but there's other kinds, but not bread yeast. So you will go to YouTube University, okay? And you will see people who tell you this yeast is perfectly fine. No. If you're going to use your super important, expensive ingredient, don't use bread yeast, use wine yeasts, please, okay? Bread yeast lack the ability to fully process the sugars and often stop early. When they stop early, that's another sign for stress. Stress equals jet fuel. So honey, water, and yeast, simplifying it back to yeast, right? I'm gonna roll through these and not belabor them. Yeasts have different properties. You've heard me say that, okay? And you're gonna select it for what you want. If you want, you could drink a glass of water and it's plain straight water, and you could drink a really nice apple juice, and you know what I mean when I say it has body, right? If you pick the right kind of yeasts, some of the gas, flavor, whatever, gives a mouthfeel. And you drink a wine or you drink a mead that's made with a specific yeast, it has a really unctuous, luxury feel to it. How clear your mead is depends on sometimes the yeast. How the yeast flocculates and clears itself is a property of some of the yeasts. Some do really well. There's a flocculate gauge on every one of the charts to tell you how exemplary. If your yeast doesn't flocculate, you have to use something like a fining agent, which you put in and it absorbs all the particles and it takes it down to the bottom, and then you can rack it off. Whatever the residual mass, that's impacted by the yeast. Okay, and if mead is allowed to age on the lees, you get that funky, nutty, yeasty flavor. And different yeasts operate differently with that. As I said, pig out or graze, how the yeast burns through the sugars available to it over the specific amount of time can impact the ABV. And there are some yeasts that work at specific temperature ranges, depending on where you're producing this in your house and how that works, whether you're doing it in summer versus winter and so on. So again, you should do a little homework. If in doubt, go and look for BA11, CY309. You're not going to remember these, but when you go say, what's a good yeast for mead? They're almost always the top two. Here are some ideas for various manufacturer strains suitable for the different types of mead that you might make. At the back of this presentation, if you go look at it, it explains what a melomel is. It's mead with added fruits. It explains what the sizer is, mead with apples. And if you're using that particular combination, there's a yeast for that. So take a minute and go look at websites for yeasts and buy the right one if you're venturing past the basic mead. This is Bob. I'll turn it over to Bob. Do we want to take a break or keep rolling? Okay.
Okay. I have.
You're hooked.
I have.
I'm going to turn it off from here.
I have to make sure. Am I on?
You want to stay running for when you show us the equipment over there?
Yeah, I'm not going to take it off.
Okay.
Yes. Sir. Okay. So this is what we did in January at Kevin's house. So first you want to figure out where you're going to work. Kitchen is a great place. You have access to the water. It needs to be clean. So when you make mead, just like when you make wine, it doesn't have to be sterile, okay? It has to be clean. And what does that mean? That means it has a low level of bacteria and fungi, okay? And the way you do that, is that in one of these next slides? I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's star sand and all those things.
Okay. Whoop.
That was the wrong button.
It's this button on the right, so go forward. I know, I did the same thing.
Woo. Okay, so again, you want to make sure your kitchen is clean, right? Why clean? We talked about that. So it doesn't have to be sterile, but it does have to be clean. And by clean, I mean just low levels. So you need something that's going to control the bacteria, the wild yeast, and any fungi that might be in there. This is what we did. We used 3 different buckets. So again, if you're going to use a plastic bucket, you want to make sure it's food grade, right? Just like what you put your honey in. So you're going to eat this stuff. You can clean with powdered brewery wash. You can, oh, it's not FDA safe. Ooh. Clean place. Again, there's a lot of different ways to clean. The way I have always cleaned, especially when I was making wine, but even when you make this, is you use a material called, it's not on here, is it? Sodium bicarbonate? Going the wrong way?
Go back.
Go back.
Back is left. Back.
There we go.
Okay.
Just one aside. This is PBW. And the purpose of this stuff is when you put it in, if you have any residual sediment, almost like super clean stuff, you know what I mean? What's it called? Simple Green, and obviously it's not flavored. OxyClean. This stuff gets your stuff clean, clean, clean. That's what PBW is.
Okay. Want to make sure that after you clean it, you get all the cleaning agent out. Makes sense, right? Sanitize. So what I always used, and you can use this in mead, is potassium metabisulfite, okay? Because the sulfur that's in there is what kills the wild yeast. So when you clean with that, again, you're killing a lot of the yeast and you're lowering it. Kevin, I guess we use star sand?
We use star sand.
Which I think is,
Here, when we turn the lights on, you can see it. It's a different cleaning agent.
yeah. most of them, the potassium metabisulfite, you can make up a solution of it, and it's what is about the same as this, 1 ounce to 5 gallons of water, and then that solution is good for 6 months. So you can use it to rinse out your equipment before you're going to use it, right? That's how you're going to sanitize it. You're not going to sterilize it, but you're going to rinse it with this sanitizing solution. So you make up some potassium metabisulfite, you can keep it for 6 months. Some people use bleach. Now, what's the problem with using bleach? Yeah, you got to get all the bleach out of there. You know, we're going to talk about water, and, you know, if you're going to worry about the water, you don't want to be leaving bleach residual on your equipment. Okay, you need your equipment. We're going to go over here and show you all this stuff later. You can touch it, feel it, and just like, I'll say one thing now, because I brought a lot of stuff. Just like beekeeping, 90% of the stuff you don't need. That's in the catalogs. But if you really get into it, you want to have them. So you'll have all these little gadgets, like I have a little bottle cleaner that goes on my faucet and things like that, right? I have a corker that puts the corks in my bottle, right? So that you can get into it as much as you want or as little as you want. So we have a lot of stuff.
There, so you can see you in the camera.
Better.
Sorry, spoken like the video about it.
All right, so we talked before, you need a good scale, right? Because you're going to measure it all out. It's got to be close, not exactly right. You got to make sure everything is clean, and then you're going to mix it together. And you need there's certain things you do need. You need a hydrometer, for example. You need the airlocks, and we'll talk about that. An airlock is basically a one-way valve. It's good. So when we go through the process, you'll see what some of the basic equipment is that you really need and some of the stuff that you don't need. So you know you need your yeast, you need your nutrients, you need to know when they're going to be added. And again, if you have a stubborn haze, sometimes you can use pectic enzyme, okay? Because pectin is what makes jelly, right? So sometimes it's pectin that's causing that haze in your wine. But there are other finding agents, and we're going to talk about them. Bentonite, which is a clay, things like that. So you know what needs to be. Now, the second bullet there is important. Yeast rehydration. When you add the yeast, or you pitch the yeast, that's the terminology, just like beekeeping. You got to know all the terms. So you pitch the yeast into the must. Got that? Okay. You want to get that yeast started so that once you put it into the must, it's ready to go. So you want to make sure that you rehydrate it, and again, right temperature, right amount of time before you pitch it into the must. Adding nutrients, we talked about how 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours, or when your specific gravity is a third of what you're looking for. And we're going to talk about, so you asked before, what is racking? So racking is basically decanting. All right, what you're doing is as the yeast dies, it's all going to fall to the bottom. So racking is the term they use in brewing, is just taking that liquid off the top and leaving all the sediment at the bottom, okay? And we're going to show you a couple of little tools to do that, yeah. We could actually do it with some water. We get some water in there. To do quality ingredients. So this is important, right? If you use junk in it, it's going to be junk out of it, right? So you want to use really good tasting honey, your best honey, right? You want to make sure that you're using good water. So if you're in a municipal system and there's chlorine in the water, that's not what you want to use, right? So if that's the case, then you want to use either spring water or, pure water that's purer. So it's important because just like the honey, it's going to have an impact on the flavor.
Can you use Camden tablets with tap water that's chlorinated?
That's a good question.
What was the question?
Can you use Camden? So Camden tablets are potassium metabisulfite, but it's in a tablet form. Can you use that, and will that take the chlorine out? I don't think it will, but I don't know that for sure.
They use different products.
So there's chloramine and there's Camden, right? So I've heard of both of them being used. I brew beer, and when I use tap water, I use Camden tablets. But I don't know, have you ever used them in mead making?
I'm spoiled. I have well water and it tastes amazing, so I've never had to struggle with that. But what I've heard about from different people in talking mead over time, most municipal systems have gotten away from using chlorine. They use something chlorine-esque, but it stays in the water. And when you put things in to try and draw that flavor out, it doesn't take it out. And most of the people that I've talked to said, just go buy bottled water. Yeah, don't try to, I mean, you know, look, you might have success with it, but it's just as easy to go down to Walmart and buy bottled water.
So we have some Camden tablets over there. You mentioned that you're a brewer, so I was a winemaker. In winemaking, you actually would add one of those Camden tablets to the wine must because it will kill the wild yeast. Not just suppress it, it will kill them. So that might be something you do in brewing. You don't do that in mead, from what I've seen. We talked about the end in mind. It's a lot of good honey in there, so we started out with a 1 gallon because if it turns out to be jet fuel, you don't care. But if you make 5 gallons of it, that's an awful lot of honey in there, good honey that you could eat or sell. That we're going to show you, actually I'm going to show you a little trick with the gallons. Most wine today comes in 4-liter bottles, right? Do you know that? If you buy a jug wine, it's a 4-liter bottle. Well, that's more than a gallon. So if you have a gallon bottle and you're going to rack this off, you want to you rack off from a 4-liter bottle, that's where you want to start, and then you rack into a gallon bottle. And it's going to fit almost perfectly because you're going to lose that lees that's at the bottom. And it's important that you maintain that as small an airspace as possible above that fermentation lock, and we're going to talk about the lock. The lock is a one-way valve. So in addition to alcohol, it's giving off carbon dioxide. And so what you want is you want the carbon dioxide to be able to go out, but you don't want air to go in. Okay, so that's what your lock is. We talked about the end in mind. What kind of mead do you want to make? And what's the gravity? And again, there's that formula. All right, so let's say we're going to make some wildflower mead. Here we go. This is what you're going to need. So again, about 3, and this is for 1 gallon, right, Kevin? Yes, 1 gallon. So for a 1 gallon batch, you're using a little over 3 pounds of honey. You know, it's a lot of honey. So imagine if you're making 5 gallons, how much you need, and then what if it goes bad your first time around? So it really is important to just start with 1. So you need your honey, your water. This is the yeast that's recommended. I think the key that we learned from Sergio, and Kevin stressed it, it's feeding the yeast is usually the missing piece for most people. Or even for a winemaker like me, in winemaking, you dump all the nitrogen in at once. All the nutrients go in the beginning, and then it just ferments until it's done. These yeasts, when you're making mead, because I think the flavors are more subtle in mead, you need to keep them at their optimal producing, okay? So you want to keep them happy. Yeah, this is another thing. So sometimes you'll see these formulas and they're in milliliters, right? So it says, you know, depending, if you get a formula and say it's from Europe somewhere, and it's a good formula and it makes good mead, it might be in milliliters, so you might have to convert it. We got your equipment, we talk about that. Sous vide. Kevin, go ahead. What's a sous vide?
Does everybody know what a sous vide is?
Yes.
So we have a restaurant pot that we got, and we fill it with water and put the sous vide in. Sous vide is an immersion circulator. It heats the water to the specific temperature. Do you need a sous vide? Of course not. You could turn the burner on and put a thermometer in and wait till it gets there and play with the burner until you get it to the temperature you want. Ideally, we use the sous vide, and you're going to see something strange where it says, clean the outside of the honey jar bottle. The reason we did that is we wanted everything to be the same temperature. If you've made bread or used yeast for bread making, again, not recommended for this, but example, you mix it to 110 degrees based on the package of the active yeast. It's very similar here. When you read the instructions for using Go Firm in the yeasts, they want it to be at a matching temperature. When you pitch those into the must, if they're too far apart, it shocks it. So what we did to clear that equation is we heated our water that we were going to use to the right temperature, took the honey jar and put it, after scrupulously cleaning and sanitizing it, in the water and left it sit in there. You know, it was all the same temperature, the water, the honey, the yeast, and everything. It was all exactly the same. So when we put everything together, we didn't have to worry about shocking the yeast and doing all that stuff. Now, when you read about this, it's not that fussy if it's a couple degrees up and down, you know, when you mix them, but you certainly don't want them to be 20, 30 degrees difference. It's just not going to work. In our case, only in my case, I have a sous vide, so I used it. Most of you are going to hang a thermometer off the side of your pot and bring it up to 110 or whatever the degrees are.
Right, or if one's hotter than the rest,
So
you're
when you
going to
see
wait
sous
till
vide,
it
that's
cools
what it
down.
means. It's
So we
just
just
we use sous
eliminated
vide.
that step by using a sous vide. Right, Kevin?
Yep.
Okay, we talked about a little over 3 pounds of honey, 3 quarts of water. That's going to make you this is going to make you about a gallon batch, right?
Right from the calculator. You saw how to
Yeah.
do this now, right?
Cleaning, we talked about, it needs to be sanitized, not sterilized. Here's your sous vide. If you want to know,
what we just described.
yeah, you want to know more about it. I never knew what a sous vide was. Sorry, I'm not a chef. Kevin is a real foodie, so you know he knows what it was. And you need a big pot, right? So one of the things that's different from making mead and making wine is in wine you have 2 fermentations. The first fermentation you do in an open vessel that's open to the air. You want air on it. That's called the primary fermentation. And then once that's done, then you put it into the jug, and that's the secondary fermentation. But in mead making, it's just one. It goes right into the jug, okay, after you mix it up. Really important that you get the detergents out, because that'll ruin it, really ruin it. Okay, so if you're using a sous vide, this is what Kevin was just talking about, you're going to take that jar of honey and you're going to put it in the water that you're using to make your mead, so you want it to be clean, all right? If you're not, you don't need to clean the outside of the jars, obviously, right?
Why can't you put the honey in the water and warm it up?
You can. But again,
Wait, there's a backstory to this. So what Bob and I did this in January. How often do you make mead? Once a year? Depends on how crazy you are. I'm only going to make it during the winter time. In order to understand this, I wrote this presentation to remind myself how to build it. So the process is just what we did. You could do it however you wanted. If you wanted to mix the water and the honey in a pot and do it that way, that's perfectly fine. What we did, because he brought honey and I had honey, and I was making a couple 1 gallons, he was making a couple 3 gallons. We boiled a big old pot of water for a party, basically, which is why this process sounds this way. You do it however it makes sense, but the common sense part is you got to get the water to temperature, you got to get the honey to temperature when you mix them together and make it match the yeast. That's the key takeaway. This is just physically, step by step, the process that we followed. So just go with it and understand why it says it, right?
again, so if you're using a sous vide, here's what you want to do. You put a screen in the bottom. Again, You're going to bring, the idea of the sous vide is that everything is going to be at the same temperature. All right, so you want your vessel to be at temperature. You put your water in.
I want you to understand this part. You're going to understand where 104 degrees came from. Where did that number come from? When you read the Go Firm instructions, this is what it tells you to do. Add the water at 104 degrees and mix the Go Firm in. Bring it in a microwave and warm it to 110 degrees. This is what the product instruction was. Once you get it to 110 degrees, you let it cool down to 104. And then once it's to 104, you stir in the yeast and pitch it. Which is why the sous vide, while all this is going on, is holding the water and the honey at 104 degrees. So when this is done and at the right temperature, we can put the two together and not clash at temperature. Now you understand the process, right? But again, you can manage this however you want to do it in your kitchen.
Sounds like chemistry class, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yep.
Reminds me of making soap.
And
There you
proper Mead people will probably laugh at the specificity of this, but no jet fuel, that's why.
Okay, so you've got your honey in the water, you put it into a carboy, that's another term. A carboy is just a glass or a plastic jug. Okay, they come in all sizes, 1 gallon, 3 gallon, 5 gallon. Pitching the yeast, you want to get the yeast to the right temperature. You open it depending on whether it's a wet yeast or a dry yeast, and there's some dry yeasts over there you can take a look at. You know, there's so many brewing stores around today. When I started making wine 15 years ago, not a lot of people were making wine, and a lot of people, nobody was brewing beer.
All of this stuff you
back
can order
then.
off the internet. And the Go Firm gives that yeast the initial food it wants. That's the point. You mix the yeast with the Go Firm and you add it in the beginning. It gets it kick-started.
Okay, we said 24, 48, 72, right? So you want to feed it to keep it at its maximum capacity, its maximum production of converting the sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide. It's pretty cool when you have your lock on there because you can watch it. It's bubbling away, especially in the beginning. But if you're feeding it like this staggered addition, it should be pretty constant. You know, again, I go back to my winemaking days. In wine, you pour it in, it bubbles like crazy in the beginning, and then it slows down, slows down, slows down. In mead making, you want it to pretty much be the same. That's why you're feeding it like that. Racking. Once it stops fermenting, you'll see all of the lees, all of the dead yeast is going to go to the bottom. We talked before about making sure that you get that off. Usually, about 3 weeks, Kevin? You don't want to leave it on longer than that, or you start getting these off-sulfur flavors in your wine, in your meat.
It says beer because it's a beer term, as far as I know, in the definition up there. But you understand that this is the first rack, and they often recommend, because when you take it off, you'll see all the lees float down to the bottom. It'll cease bubbling. You'll rack it off and put it in a container, and you'll put an airlock on it, and because you've moved it around and did whatever, you wake up whatever yeast is left. And it will continue to ferment. If you put it in a bottle after the first rack, you risk sleeping in the middle of the night and mead exploding in your kitchen and blowing all over the ceiling. Don't do that. It is really highly recommended that you rack it a second time, and just in case there's more fermentation to go that you didn't notice, then once you're confident it's really done, you put it in a bottle. And again, remember, you don't want to leave it on the lees. Don't get lazy and forget about it, because it'll develop that off taste.
How much time should you wait before you do the final bottling? How much time should the second
So typically, you would bottle after, once it's clear, right, and the yeast is all gone and it's clear as can be, you would bottle it. But then you would let it age in the bottle, usually for a year or more. A lot of mead makers will tell you 2 years. If you can leave it for 2 or 3 or 4, it'll be even better and better. So,
This-
Do you try
the lights
it
on,
before you rack it?
See how clear that is?
yeah,
I made 2 1-gallon batches. The other one is still cloudy. This one cleared out. So you have to wait till it settles. They take different times, different yeasts.
Typically take between the first racking and the second racking.
It depends. It depends.
so Randy's question is, do you taste it as it's going through this process? Sure. And especially if you're using a siphon like I have here, you know, you start that siphon by sucking on the hose and then the liquid starts coming down. So you take a little taste and you'll taste it. And if it tastes bad at that stage, it's not going to get better. So that's number one, right? So
That's how you rack it, is by siphoning it.
it's by siphoning.
By siphoning it, or you use some of these tools. Let me show you what this is.
Yeah, they make all kinds of things.
This tool has a plunger on the bottom. You put it down into your carboy, and when you pull on it, it creates a suction and it flows out of the hose and down. Obviously, you want this higher than the one below it. This is the same thing. You put this on the cap of the carboy, and you create a suction with your mouth. Your mouth is not in contact with whatever. You're just creating the suction, and it pulls it up, and it goes out of the hose and into the thing. So there's 2 possible options. They have something called a wine thief, which you could put down and hold your finger on it or push a button, and it'll fill the tube up, and you could take it and turn it and put it in for when you want to take a reading. So this is, it's show and tell time, folks. This is what you would take your reading from. You generally try not to take your hydrometer and put it in your carboy. You take product out and you put it in your flask, and then you float your carboy in here, or float your hydrometer in here. There is a hydrometer in here, so be careful, don't turn it over, it's made of glass, it'll break. But there is one in here, and we could take it out if you want to see what one looks like. You saw the picture.
So this is, you know, again, it can get as complicated as you want. All you really need is a piece of Tygon tubing, right? And you put one of them up high, the one you're going to transfer into below, and you just start like this. All right, now it's started. I can put it in here.
There's some
it's
people on
gonna
the
suck it
internet that
all
are
up.
crying right now because he used his mouth. Just so you know. In
Remember,
proper
it's not
ways,
sterile.
you're not supposed to. Right? But if you're drinking it, no, that's, I don't even want to try to qualify it. But yeah, there's so many people that do that. And this is Go Firm, bought from the internet. These are open, so if you come and look at them, just be careful. This is Fermento, and if you smell them, they smell like bread yeast. This is,
When you did that, you sucked up all the yeast crap, right?
So again, that's right. So you wouldn't start there, right? If you're going to be doing this, once you started that suction, you'd be up here where all the liquid is. And as it starts going down, then you'd go down, 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 down. And then you hit a point where you're going to stop. And so again, you're going to leave a little in there because you don't want to suck those lees up. So you're just going to go down, down, down. And that's why this has an end, so that that clip this to the pot, number one. And then this is so that when you put it at the bottom, it's not sucking right off the bottom, it's sucking from the top here. So again, these are all gizmos. You'll learn how to rack it, and you can use your mouth if it's your mead.
you could use your mouth if it's your mead and you're going to drink it quickly. This is the yeast. This is CY3079. This is BA11. These are 2, from what I know, of the most common ones. Again, you could just buy them off the internet. Yeah, I know. It has to do with the strain. And when you look these up from the companies, Lavlin or whoever it is, there's a couple of key companies that you deal with. They'll tell you how to handle all those. There's a story behind these 2. When you get to the bottom, you're going to leave mead on the lees. I don't want to waste it, and I don't mind funky. That's what this is. I poured what was left in the bottom of the carboy into this peanut butter jar and let it settle. And if you look, you'll see there's lees on the bottom. Now, I've cleaned this twice and it's still settling. It was super, super cloudy, and this will leak if you leak because it's a peanut butter jar. But if you open this up and smell it, and if you want to take one of those tasting spoons from the honey and taste it, you'll get the yeasty. This is what happens if you leave it on the lees too long. I want you to taste this so you know that, remember that
Lysis.
Lysis. This is what happens if you leave it on there. I don't know if you like make bread with it. Last story to tell you is, we mix the must. You had a question?
Could you clean it by running it through like a coffee filter?
It's not, I don't think there's any real good way to get the funky yeasty out of it. I don't know of any. Even if you put fining agents, which,
No particulate, is it?
yeah, it's not. It's really yeast byproduct in the,
Yeah, I make
That's-
kombucha and you get that.
yes.
product.
Yeah, if you like kombucha, you're not too bad on that. I honestly have drank some of that, and I don't think it tastes too bad. These are sparkleoid and bentonite, the two fining agents. If you open these and look, the one looks like clay powder. And if you put this in, it collects everything that's floating, and that might help you with this. This one right here says natural on it. When we finished making our mead, there was enough must left over that I said, I'm going to take a jar of it and just put it in here and let it be. Natural yeast. We taste this, it's amazing. It did not turn to jet fuel. In fact, it's almost like champagne. It has an effervescence to it, which is whatever yeast happened to be in that honey, it's really, really good. That is complete and utter serendipity.
So I had to ask, have you ever done anything with like mixed cultures? So you're using very clean wine yeast, right?
Yeah,
I come from a world where I grew with wild yeast.
yes.
I like to make sour beer, but specifically, there's Brett's, there's all types of bacteria in it. Have you ever experimented with anything like that? Other than that, which is also wild yeast, which I'm very interested in.
Yeah, right now I'm just good enough at trying, I'm doing this in stages, and quite frankly, what I wanted to be able to do, the key sign of a proper mead maker is they can make a plain mead first and get it right, and then they can do the add-ins. So I'm not venturing off other paths like wild yeast. It interests me, but for right now, if I could consistently use that formula to make good mead time over time, then the next step I'm going to go in is, I made my COVID thing. I have about 40 different kinds of extracts and alcohol and liqueurs. I made, cherry bounce, if you've ever had that. Oh God, so good. I made almond extracts and banana extracts and all of that stuff. I played around with all of those different things, and mead is just one of the derivatives of that type of thing. So yeah, that's fun what you're doing.
So there are resources, and it is explored.
Yeah, so you'll find that in the mead world, there are people doing really extreme and fun things. They're making peanut butter and jelly meads that when you drink it, it tastes like peanut butter and jelly. And the way they're doing that is through different ingredients and combinations and stuff. Follow Sergio. Sergio is a savant. He has a Mead Made Right podcast. He doesn't record them anymore because he just has too many things going. But if you go through his back catalog, he explains to you the process. A lot of what I designed came from his process and saturating what he learned.
You have known where somebody's taken the must and run it through the distilling process.
Yeah, there's people making spirits out of this stuff and
Yeah.
other things too. It's a little too exotic for me. I'm just looking to have a good mead to drink. Questions?
Yeah, hey, I know that you're going down a very disciplined and very clean approach to making mead. people are aware of anyone using, say, bee pollen as nutrient, or maybe larvae, bee bread, something like that, so another product from the hive that bees use.
So I made a propolis extract. I put I froze the propolis and ground it and put it in alcohol and made that. I have heard people say they put propolis in their mead. It's a little funky flavor. It's not that far from a yeast, but it's a totally different thing. Not too different from if you eat pollen. Again, there's people doing stuff like that, but I've never done any of it. Yeah. Anything else, Bob, you can think of?
No,
Anything
just-
on the table we
Tell-
missed that we should talk about?
There's resources at the end of this presentation after the questions, so
Yeah.
things like this tells you all the different kinds of meads you can make. So if you make a mead and you have a sack mead, you make something with spices, it's called a methagellin. So this is in there if you want it. And also, we threw a lot of terms at you today, so there's also a chart in there that's got all the terms on it. So when they start throwing these lees and must and all this stuff around racking, you'll be able to understand what it is.
Like, for example, in the back of this presentation you'll find online, they'll tell you the types of meads. If you add this to it, it's a melomel. If you add this, it's a sizer, a murad, a capsicum, it's honey water, and chili peppers. You can see down there mead types and regional styles. There's tons and tons of them. And if you look these up, you can find recipes for them. This is a resource that Bob was talking about various things that are out there. There's a couple tips
Yeah.
and stuff in here.
Made
This is
dandelion
the
wine one
terminology.
time. It was actually pretty good.
So if something we said tonight doesn't make sense, it's in here. Yes, this is on beekcorner.org. It's the latest. Just search for presentations and you'll find it. So welcome to the world of mead. Hopefully we've inspired you to go home and make good mead. Thanks for... And do come up and play with the